this question comes from a project that I coordinate, funded by the European Commission, and it's called PIGWEB. Perfect. And PIGWEB is not focusing on a research question, not on a question that we all have. It's focusing on the infrastructures, tools that we have that we use for research. So what is PIGWEB? As I said, it's a 5-year project by a large number of partners that you see here listed in Europe. And as I said, we focus on the tools that we use for research. It has a budget of 5 million euros for these 5 years. And it has 3 elements that were set out by the European Commission. It should have transnational access, meaning that we make the infrastructures that we have available for your research questions. Making available means you can come to us, you can do your experiments in these facilities, and Europe will pay for these experiments. So it's a free ride. It has a budget of 1.5 million euros. We have 3 calls for this. The second call is open right now. So if you want to do your research in one of these facilities of PIGWEB, contact me, look at the PIGWEB website, or Sam Millet, who's also in the room, can help you out. But it's really, it's your choice to do a free experiment in one of these facilities. Then we also have joint research activities where we focus on the tools. How can we make these tools better? Or how can we make the research less invasive or non-invasive? And then we also have some networking activities. One of the objectives of the project has many objectives. One of the objectives of the project is to map the installations beyond the partners of the project and to identify user needs and make recommendations for future research infrastructures. Make these recommendations to legislators, universities, and national authorities, what is needed for, in this case, big research, but we can generalize it to animal research. There are other aspects that we also deal with: harmonization of protocols, data, open data collection, how we conserve data for the future, etc. I'm not going to detail that here because you can read it in the abstract and on the website. Now, we do this in a very specific context because there was last year a motion of the European Parliament, and that motion said the European Parliament calls on the European Commission, the executive branch of the Parliament, to active phase-out procedures on live animals for scientific and regulatory purposes as soon as scientifically possible and without lowering the level of protection for human health and the environment. That's a quite strong statement, we can say. And the European Parliament also underlines that there are cases where animal experiments are still needed to gain scientific insights in the long search for an effective remedy for certain diseases. Nothing about animal science, nothing about animal production, diseases. Academic institutions, we have an essential role to play in the terms of promoting alternatives to animal testing in scientific disciplines and disseminating new knowledge and practices, which are available but not always widely used. Now, this was a motion, and it was voted for in the European Parliament. Here you see the European Parliament. The votes were 667 in favor, 4 against, and 16 abstentions. So that is a major challenge for us. And that is something that we have to think about. We have different questions. How do we deal with this? And one of the main questions, is there a future for experimental animal research in Europe and its infrastructures? How do we interact with society and legislators on experimental animal research? Because we can perhaps provide arguments to say this is how we can do research in the future. What type of research infrastructures do we need? And how do we share this amongst each other? And for us, all of us, how do we train future generations of animal scientists that will be working 20, 30 years with the tools that we are deciding on now? So these are the 4 questions that I'd like you to address. I hope the people with the microphone can run around a lot. Some will make notes. We'll take your feedback back to the European Commission to say this is what we think, this is what animal scientists think is needed. So the floor is yours. What is needed?
Hi, you mentioned sharing. I'm a big fan of it because it's really important that people know, and specifically also children, where the food is coming from. So, to my opinion, we're doing great science, but if no one knows where the food is coming from, so we have really to, what should I say, start from the scratch because they just go in the supermarket, the kids, and see it's sausages and milk, but they do not link it to animals. And I don't mean like children from the countryside. I really mean children from the city. So because they might have never seen a cow or a pig, and that's why we're getting less acceptance from society. And I know from my own experience that's easier to teach children than adults. I'm sorry. It's really hard to convince people that it's important to do research to improve different things. But yeah, it's easier to do with children. So I really would appreciate if we could do and set up really a program from the EU. Where is our food coming from? It's not about healthy food. It's really about where it's coming from.
I fully agree, and I think if we look in how we communicate sector, animal production sector, about animal food production, we don't communicate. We don't communicate. And communicating about research on this is even more difficult. So can you imagine how you would communicate to your neighbor about what you're doing on daily life? We have to develop arguments. I mean, I think among us we agree, but how do we have the arguments to communicate with legislators and society?
Hi.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
As someone who actually does a lot of science communication, I think that getting just the message out there is really important. There's programs like Skype a Scientist, which I've signed up as an ag scientist. And I get a lot of requests from classrooms just to come to talk to students about where their food comes from. But also, my sister is a dietitian and she teaches a course for future dietitians that's literally where does your food come from? Because if you're going to be giving people advice about what to eat, you probably should know how it's grown. And I just really wish we could expand that, make it so that especially the medical community, or even people in the food science, people in culinary science don't often learn more about where their food comes from. If we could look at the extension framework we have and sort of branch out into maybe medical extension and culinary extension, I think that would be a really good opportunity. That's something I've been trying to do on my own a little bit through volunteering. And I give a lecture on beef and sustainability to my sister's students. But I think if we had targeted efforts, I think that would be especially helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps we need to change also the approach how do we work. Instead, for example, of bringing animals to the lab and working with them under highly controlled conditions, we can go to the farm and apply some sort of field relevant techniques. One, for example, can be exploiting more of the NIRS technique, for example, looking at feces, or instead of recreating diseases or heat stress, for example, we can go to the field where the animals are already suffering. I don't know.
Okay. What about sharing data, sharing samples?
Yeah,
I looked how many publications we wrote in animal and veterinary science last year. We wrote 15,000 papers. So as a legislator, you say, you wrote as a community 15,000 papers. What did you do with it? How did we use it? How are we going to reuse this? Any ideas about sharing? Are you willing to share data with your publication? Are you willing to conserve your samples so that others can look at it from a different perspective?
Yeah.
Luis, go ahead.
Jerome? Yeah, it's Luis. I think it's data sharing depends on who's funding, what is the source, and what are the strings attached to that. I think it is important, but you have to develop a database, right? So who's going to be in charge of that and where the funds coming for that? And who's going to evaluate the data, validate the data, and so forth. You know, all of this stuff. So going back to, I think, one of the previous comments, something that was not brought up is accountability and responsibility of the media that are responsible to advertise information. And that I think we need to pay a lot of attention because, like we said, there is, I think, a lack of information to the public from the science community in general. And then I see some of this publication and stuff like this advertising. So I think it needs to be more accountability and responsibility to that.
I know between 15,000 papers being written, which means the scientists do not have lots of free time, and accountability of the press. I mean, we have challenges. Where we're at, we are seeing about hiring someone specifically to translate our research. The scientist works with this person to translate our research to go out into the popular press, to go out where people who do not work with agriculture maybe can get a better understanding of why it matters. But you need someone who can translate. And most of us haven't had the time, but back with training early career animal scientists, maybe some of the translation needs to be part of their training as well.
Anybody else? Yes, in the back.
Hi, Jaap. Thanks for throwing the topic again. This conference, I really like it. Yeah, maybe something a bit naive from me, but you said we publish about 15,000 papers a year. So we can imagine how many papers or data are not published. It's a bit naive, but we need, I think, a new system to reward also the publication of negative results, as we call them. It's to me answering the problem of the repeatability of the experiments. Better to not repeat something which is not working. And yeah, that's about it. I don't know if the European Commission can help on that, but that's an idea for us, for our community.
Okay, thank you. So we still have 3.5 years for the project to go, and we will continue talking with you about this. So be prepared if you haven't had the opportunity to talk about this yet with us. Next year, we'll try to have a session at the EAP. We will have a similar session about what is there a future for animal experimentation in Europe. So thank you very much.